Well, hello again from downtown Seattle, and welcome to Habitat's live VIP event today, a conversation with Matthew Desmond. Matthew, boy, you are terrific. You provided such an important perspective as part of Habitat's Beyond the Build event today, and we really appreciate it. It's so good to see you again.
Good to see you, Dave. Yeah,
How's it
thank you.
going?
It's going okay. It's going okay. We're busy. We're worried about the eviction moratorium coming to an end. We're kind of thinking about how to respond to that, what data people need for that. So we're busy just like you are over there on the other coast.
Yeah, before we start, we want to thank all of our VIPs, all you very important people who are with us right now for your support of Habitat's mission. Together, we're really making a difference here in Seattle, King County. Obviously, there's always a lot more work to be done, but we appreciate your tremendous support. We're going to start out with a few questions for Matthew to get the conversation started, and then open it up to all of you to ask some questions. Please select the raise your hand feature if you can, which will notify me that you have a question for Matthew. And when I call your name, you'll be unmuted to ask your question. You can also enter your questions into the chat for Matthew if you want, and we will read those aloud as time permits. So Matthew, maybe we can get started with just a few questions to get people thinking about what they may want to ask you. But your book and Arlene's story centered on the private rental market. Where do you see affordable homeownership fitting into the solution?
I think it's a big part of the solution. Arlene was renting a place for $550 a month when I met her. If she bought a place in the same neighborhood under a conventional mortgage, she'd probably be paying around $60, $70 a month in mortgage. And so there's a lot of people like Arlene that are very credit poor, but could actually afford the terms of a stable mortgage. And so I think the work that Habitat is doing on this score is incredibly important and forward thinking. And the work that other organizations are doing to try to open up the mortgage space for families previously denied homeownership is really important.
At this point, the federal moratorium on evictions expires at the end of the month. What do you think the impact of ending eviction moratoriums and related utility moratoriums will be? What kind of impact do you think that will have on vulnerable communities? And do you have any solutions maybe to propose?
Yeah, I mean, there's a way to, the way I've been thinking about this question, there's a policy side that I'm thinking of, and then there's just this other side. And the policy side of things is like, it's just a tad premature. We're getting rental relief out there. The federal government has had to create a network of distributors that from scratch, right, to distribute almost the entire budget of HUD, right, about $50 billion. So just like an enormous amount of relief coming through a million different channels. And it's not all there yet, obviously, and so I think that the media coverage of this has been a little unfair. I talked about like bureaucratic fumbling, and it's just the thing they're doing is really hard. And so I'd like to see a little bit more time before that moratorium lifts. I don't think we're going to get it, though. I think it's going to lift. And one of the things I'm concerned about is the neighborhoods with the highest rates of eviction risk right now are also neighborhoods that tend to have the lowest rates of vaccination. So I don't think, we're not out of the woods yet when it comes to COVID, and especially in neighborhoods that are both most at risk for displacement and COVID. And then there's this other stuff. So one of the things I'd like to see is a little more time. I'd like to see a third-party negotiator help out between landlords and tenants. That could be a lawyer, that could be someone else, or just someone to mediate this relationship. But then on the other side of things, the non-policy side of me, my writer side, I suppose, it's just like, we had an eviction moratorium. I lived in a country that had an eviction moratorium for a year. It prevented over 1.5 million evictions. It dropped the death rate by 11%. And there's a part of me that just is a little sad, and to see something like that fall away. Yeah.
We've got our first question. We want to go to Mike, who has a question for you. Mike?
Thanks. Very powerful book, by the way, of course. So what you said today about the huge wait list, super long wait list for public housing, it's so upsetting. And I don't feel like I see any national conversation about really addressing that. And I wonder what the prospects might be for that, and what's an angle that might make some difference there.
Yeah, you're right. I think that, there was a time in the country where the federal government was organized like this: Department of Defense, and then HUD, public housing, an investment in the home for a lot of different Americans, middle class, working class, and poor Americans. And, and that budget was severely slashed in the 80s, just hasn't recovered. And then we had this like giant public mistake we made, right, with how we did public housing. And you think of these like Robert Taylor homes, Pruitt Igoe in St. Louis. Now we built these giant towers in very segregated poor neighborhoods and then just defunded them, and they fell into chaos and ruin. And so I do think there has been a tendency for federal policymakers to not touch housing, but I think that is waning, and I think it's moving up slowly on the domestic agenda. President Biden, for example, has a plan to expand housing vouchers to everyone that qualifies for them, something I advocated for in the end of my book. That hasn't made it onto the floor of the Senate yet, but it's something that at least is on the president's mind. I think one angle to get to this, for me anyways, is just like a very simple refrain, which is like everyone needs a stable home. Just everyone needs this, no matter what we care about. If we care about fiscal responsibility, if we care about education, everyone really needs this. And we know how to get it to a lot of Americans. We know how to pay for it. And so we can go into the policy details if you want, but I'm both encouraged, but also share your frustration.
All right, we have a question coming in from Vince here, and I'll read this one, Matthew. Do you see race as a significant factor in addition to having children?
Oh, yes. So one of the things you learn very quickly when you're in this kind of work is that race is like the story. It's the central story. I remember when I wrote a book on Milwaukee, and then we collected these hundreds of millions of eviction records from all over the country, and we got to see where evictions were happening. So before we unveiled that, I thought, okay, where do I think evictions are happening? They're probably in Rust Belt cities, like the city I spent time with. Maybe there are a lot in Buffalo or in Cleveland. And we unveiled this map, for the first time we got to see nationally what the problem looks like. And it's straight through the Southeast, and then up the Mississippi to Detroit is like America's eviction hotspot. And it just clusters so deeply in majority African-American counties. The old story about race and racial inequality is just so central to this story. One really easy way to understand this for me anyways is like, we've had this systematic dispossession of people of color from the land, particularly African-Americans from the land, from slavery to sharecropping to the Great Migration, the ghettoization of families, the rise and fall of public housing, even up to the subprime mortgage crisis, where research has shown that low-income communities of color were targeted by predatory lenders. And so we've created in that history this kind of semi-permanent renter class in African-American Latino communities. Most of those families are renters versus most white families who are homeowners. So I think that distinction alone makes race really central to this conversation.
Matthew, our next question comes from Tom. Tom, are you there? All right. Tom, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for taking questions. Over the past several months, Habitat has hosted a number of book club events on your book. And it was kind of a classic book club event talking about what you learned and so forth. And typically at the end, there was an opportunity to talk about what could be done to improve the eviction situation beyond the vouchers that you talked about.
Yeah.
And one thing that was brought up was the notion of tenant training. When somebody goes into an apartment, is there some kind of training about what to do and what not to do, similar to what Habitat does for new homeowners? They teach them about how the house is constructed and how the systems work and so forth. So I'm wondering what your thoughts would be about training for renters. Do you think that could help reduce the friction between the renters and the landlords? Because some of the stories you told in your book, the landlords got upset with the renters for pouring grease down the drain and things like that. So would this kind of training be helpful?
Potentially, maybe. I think that the places we've seen the highest returns on that kind of investment have been the places where that that training goes along with a certain right being extended to tenants or an expansion of opportunities to tenants. So for example, in New York City, they passed a right to counsel for tenants in eviction court. So every tenant that's threatened with eviction in our largest city in America now has a lawyer by their side, just like a public defender in criminal court. And what they found when they did that is tenants were much more likely to report housing violations to the city too. We're much more likely to fight to stay in their homes when they were being informally evicted, for example. They decreased evictions by 40% in New York City, comparing these numbers to 2013. So I think that training alone, I don't think we're going to get a ton of returns for that investment, but training along with something just like the habitat model, right? You're training along with an investment in housing, built housing. I think we could see some returns. There's also, man, if you're spending 70-80% of your income on rent, sometimes you do things that look strange to people that aren't spending that much of their money on housing, but makes sense, like in the context. Let me just give you one quick example. In Milwaukee, I saw a lot of people fall behind, but they weren't that behind. They might have been $100 short, $50 short. Well, we might think, well, call your landlord up, give him a call, see if you can negotiate. But what the tenants thought was, what's going to happen is I'm going to give my landlord $400 when I owe $5, and I'm going to be evicted anyway. So I might as well keep the $5 and go through with the eviction. And so I think these under conditions of like extreme, like duress that the tenants are dealing with, some of the training might just grind against their reality too sometimes. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Tom. Matthew, as we talked about during our program, Habitat provides a hand up to hardworking families, not a handout, of course. Do you think Arlene, the mother that you profiled in Milwaukee and the other families you wrote about, do you believe that they would be good homeowners?
I do. I think that one of the things that we notice in the behavioral literature, the behavioral economics, I'm sorry to take such a very human question and answer it like a nerd, but just I'll get back to that heart of it too. But a lot of times, in the behavioral economic literature, you see people under conditions of scarcity make bad decisions, and they make bad decisions because we all make bad decisions under those conditions, and you can kind of manipulate this in a lab. So there's a famous experiment. It says, okay, Dave, you memorize 2 numbers, and okay, Matt, you memorize 7, just randomly distributed. And then they put us in the same waiting room, and they put cake and fruit in front of us, just like a snack to wait. But the waiting's actually the experiment. And it turns out the person that's memorized a 7-digit number eats the cake 50% more of the time, right? Because that part of your brain where you're like, don't eat the cake, is just kind of consumed by that 7-digit. That's what poverty's like. It's like when you're in the hospital. You remember the hospital waiting room? And like there's a ton of time before you, but you just can't do anything because your mind is captured about, your loved one in the other room. That's kind of what poverty's like. And so it also means that when we ease people's burden, people actually make better decisions. It's kind of the reverse of what a lot of Americans say, like, you don't want to be poor, like make better decisions. It's actually, if we ease people's burden, they start responding in a really great way. So for example, when you raise the minimum wage, smoking rates go down among the poor. Rates of child abuse go down among the poor. People sleep a little longer, that has returns. And so I think that providing someone like Arlene a home that she's proud of, a home that she can invest in, knowledge that she doesn't have to move in a few months, like a neighborhood she can root down in, I think she'd be a great homeowner. Yeah, I think you'd see real returns on that investment.
Matthew, I know when we talked, you mentioned that your family was evicted from their home. When you were in college, you volunteered for Habitat for Humanity, and thank goodness you found your wife in the process there. Do you see organizations like Habitat as being a part of the bigger equation in trying to solve this crisis? And if so, how?
Yeah, I do. I mean, my wife had this pink tool belt that she used to wear on builds. I think that maybe she had me at the tool belt. And so we've just celebrated 17 years last weekend. So, awesome. Habitat, was part of that story and our story. there's very few things that are as moving as when you go to a key ceremony at Habitat, right? And you see someone get that key and get this incredible blessing, and a community-based blessing. And so, there are things that we can talk about, the number of houses Habitat's built and that kind of thing. Those are certainly important numbers. But there's also this, like, what Habitat is doing, I feel, is it's a proof of concept, right? It's a question of what would it look like if we behave more like a full community when it comes to the housing crisis. And so you can take those kind of questions way up to the federal level. Would it look like me saying, hey, you know what? I want to invest in public housing or affordable housing in my own community, where my kids go to school, where I walk my dog. Hey, you know what? Maybe these really big homeowner benefits for, like, even people that have really expensive houses, maybe they're excessive. Maybe I can take a little bit less for people that have more. So I think Habitat leads you onto those conversations in a really powerful way.
We have a question from Vince, and Vince asks, is there a website with your data and research that you have collected?
Sure, I have two websites. So one website is just called Just Shelter, which is if anyone's kind of interested in understanding, housing organizations in the country, who's doing the work. You can go to Just Shelter and figure out who's putting in work in your own backyard. I know everyone on this call is probably really familiar with those organizations in King County already. And then we have a website just called evictionlab.org, and we really took a lot of care to design this website that holds a ton of data, but it's very interactive, it's very intuitive. A third grader can kind of use interactive maps and rankings and get your head around. Or if you want to get the raw data and go crazy, it's there for you too. But it's designed to allow data to speak to everyone, no matter what their background or their technical expertise is.
Your talk certainly sheds light on this issue in a very personal level here. What can the average person do to help?
I think volunteering for Habitat is a really great step. It's really powerful, and if you're kind of a quiet type, you can just pick up a hammer. If you're more of the social type, you can get plugged in that way. So I think that's quite powerful. That's a kind of an entry drug, in a way, to this work. I want to, the thing that I've just been, I just can't shake is, what would it look like if we, called our representatives and really asked, for those of us who are a little bit more privileged, those of us who are homeowners, those of us whose kids go to really good schools, to ask that some of the benefits that are in our life to be shared. What would that look like? Would our legislatures feel more licensed to, go down that path, to kind of say, my constituents keep calling me and, they're really eager for me to fix this problem, not somewhere else, not in the abstract, but they want skin in the game. I think that would be incredibly helpful. And if you want to know, if you want to go beyond that, you can go to this website, justshelter.org, and you can get plugged in your own community, or at least learn about what it looks like in your own town.
Part of it is all of us changing our mindsets here about affordable housing, and affordable housing in some cases next door to where we live.
Yeah, I think that this is the big blockage, right? And you can go to a place like Seattle's a rich city. Seattle has plenty of resources. There's the lack of resources is not the thing that's stopping us from taking a real leaps forward here. I remember going to the Bay Area and learning about a community organization, a kind of a collective, a consortium, had $100 million to spend. Couldn't spend it, because no one really wanted it to be spent to be housing built in their own communities. So I think that it's a challenge for us, right? It can be kind of scary. We can ask questions like, what's going to happen to my property rates? Is this going to affect my school? Is it going to affect the crime rate? So social scientists have answers to that. I think that, dispersing public housing across a city actually doesn't have a big effect on property values. It actually lowers crime rates. It can be done in a really bad way, but there's, we've kind of learned to do this right. We've kind of learned from our sins of mid-century in a way. So I do think that it's incumbent upon us, especially those of us who have benefited from historical legacies of privilege in this country, to really start having public conversations about this. Yeah.
One thing you said to me, a lot of things you said to me, but one thing you mentioned to me, which I found really interesting and something I've thought about since our conversation, is that zoning laws are a question of our own morality.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, zoning laws sound like the most boring thing we could talk about, right? But what they are is it legal to build affordable housing here or not? Is it actually against the law to build affordable housing in this community or not? And, zoning laws are kind of a distant cousin from racial kind of clauses that kept people of color out of neighborhood. They're a distant relative of redlining, right? And the federal government's role in saying, we're going to invest in this community, but not in this community. And so zoning laws take a race neutral guise, but if the zoning law says every house here has to be on a half-acre lot or 1 acre lot, no house here can be over 2 stories. I mean, that's excluding huge parts of the population. And what's sad is that, the investments we make in affordable housing, they really do matter, right? So like at the federal level, if someone has a ticket to go on the rental market, like a Section 8 voucher, and only spend 30% of their income on housing instead of 60 or 70, what if they really want their kid to go to a really good school? Or what if they want a neighborhood that's quiet, safe? Often they can't even break into those neighborhoods, not because they can't afford it, but there's like literally no place for them to live, in those neighborhoods. And that does seem like a moral choice. I'm a little out of my depths here, but I wonder if Habitat runs into this as well. Like, where can we build these houses, and do we get kind of pushback and resistance in some parts of the city and not others, which dilutes our impact, however big and impressive it is.
You talk a lot about the rental housing market, Matthew, and you've had an opportunity to talk to some landlords. What was your biggest takeaway when it comes to their concerns?
So I'm going to start in a way. I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to start in a way that it's going to sound like an anti-landlord response. And I'm going to end in a place where I don't think it is. But I want to preface that because a lot of times people come to this conversation and they're kind of like, whose side are you on? Are you pro-tenant? Are you pro-landlord? And I think I tried to write a book that really kind of messied up that division and tried to give everyone a shot at, representing everyone's positions as much as I could. But here's one huge takeaway, which is, when I was living in the mobile home park on the south side of Milwaukee, Tobin, the landlord, allowed me to copy his rent rolls, to kind of do the math, to pencil out like what he was taking in, what he was bleeding out. And so that took me about a month. It was a big calculation. I wanted to account for his mortgage, his property taxes, his water bill, everything you could, vacancies, eviction costs. And, my calculation is, the owner of the poorest trailer park in the 4th poorest city in the country was taking home about $450,000 a year after expenses. It's a lot. It's a lot. But how weird is that? How strange is that? And so I started crunching the numbers. There's actually a nationwide survey of landlords. And so we got access to that survey, crunched the numbers. And one thing I learned is that landlords in middle-class neighborhoods, after our expenses, their margins are very small. They're very thin. They kind of seem to be investing in the property and as a wealth building project. But landlords in poor neighborhoods, their margins are much bigger. They're actually double what landlords in middle-class neighborhoods are after all expenses. And the reason's really simple. Expenses are a lot lower in poor neighborhoods. Property value and property taxes are a lot lower, but rents are not as much lower as you would think. So in Milwaukee, for example, the median neighborhood, typical neighborhood, a few years ago was like $600 a month for like a 1-bedroom apartment. And the poorest neighborhood, like the poorest neighborhood, is about $550 a month. Wow. So you're paying a little less, but you're getting a lot less, in a way, in terms of neighborhood safety, school quality. So what's going on? And this is where I kind of, so yes, there's part of that. Part of what's going on is there's a predatory aspect, and some landlords are, soaking low-income properties for all they can. Some landlords are engaged in illegal behavior, but there's a lot aren't, right? There's a lot that aren't. But they're facing massive uncertainty. There is more risk taking in poor neighborhoods. And so what can they do to adjudicate that risk? Well, they can raise their prices, and kind of socialize the risk to everyone. But one unanticipated consequence of that might be just overburdening their consumer base. You get more evictions in poor neighborhoods. And a lot of times you're just going to assume that rent charge is higher profits. So if that's the case, again, sorry for the wonky answer, but for me, it's key because it fundamentally changed my view of poverty, really. It's poverty isn't just a question of historical legacies or structures, and it isn't just a question of people's decisions or education. It's also these relationships, between bosses and workers, between landlords and tenants. And if we don't understand, inequality built into those relationships, I think we get it half right. So, one thing that we could think about is how to lower the risk for landlords. One thing we could think about is how to have more transparency in our cities. Who's doing all the evictions in our cities and which landlords aren't? Which landlords are investing in stability and keeping their buildings up? So I think more transparency is always good here.
I have another question now from Vince. Vince, are you there? And if you're on mute there, Vince, we aren't able to hear you. Are you with us?
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to address when you asked about the resistance to affordable housing in the Seattle area. And there is some of that. And we have seen that. I've worked with Habitat here for 20 years, and I've done some advocacy. And we've, at different times in different neighborhoods, people get really nervous about affordable housing coming in. I think once they start seeing how well it can blend with the neighborhood, a lot of that resistance starts to melt away. And there tends to be much more of that in what you would regard as high-end neighborhoods. So we still see some of it, but hopefully I think that we're starting to move beyond that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I reminds me of this court case in I think it's Pennsylvania, or it's Mount Laurel. It was this court case about segregation, and it resulted in public housing complex. And people raised a fuss. People resisted. There was the city council rooms were packed, and heated. And they went ahead. They built Mount Laurel, and then 10 years later, like most people in the town didn't even know it was there. It was just kind of like you said, Vince. It just kind of blended into the background. I think what could really help, right, in those kind of city councils, if people like us stood up and said, you know what, I'm a homeowner here, my kids go to school here, and I'm for this.
Yeah. For another thing you mentioned to me, Matthew, we have about a minute left here, was that poverty scares some people, scares a lot of people, maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, I think it, look, there's not a lot of guarantees in the United States. And I think that means that, for some of us, we've had this incredible trajectory, an incredible ride, and we can kind of look back on our lives and we say, gosh, this country's really delivered for me. But I also think that we know, we have an amazing amount of poverty here for a country of this much resources and wealth. This land of dollars has an incredible amount of hunger and scarcity. And I think that that's a reminder to us, I think, that it could have gone the other way, or, things can fold. And if they fold, then what? Then what? Is there a net there to catch us? And I think a lot of us feel that there's not. And under those conditions, I think it can really warp our sense of freedom. And I think it can really warp our theories of poverty. And this goes way back, right? I mean, around slavery times, you had these white Yemen farmers, and they were getting bulldozed by the enslavers, the guys that owned the big plantations, and they were losing land. And but they weren't enslaved, you know, they weren't slaves. And I think that helped cultivate a kind of freedom idea in America where freedom was anti-bondage. Freedom was not slavery. That's a kind of a freedom, but that's not a freedom that puts a roof over your head or bread on your table, you know? And so I think that I'll just leave you with this, on this little last antidote. I spent 1.5 years with housing organizers in Minneapolis just before COVID hit. And they were doing like really ambitious, bold things. And one of the organizers, like they were trying to get their landlord to sell their apartments back to them. They were trying to buy their apartments back. They were doing incredible tenant organizing. It was a really beautiful movement to watch. One of the organizers was a rock climber. He was a rock climber. And I said, Roberto, does rock climbing and organizing have anything to do with each other? And he said, yes. Once you get past the fear, things really can open up. Once you get past the fear, you know, and I thought that was a beautiful word, as they say.
Well, you've given us a lot of perspective, Matthew. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great discussion, great questions from all of you. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Matthew, for making today's discussion so insightful, so informative for all of us. And we certainly appreciate the wonderful book you have written and the wonderful work you're doing. It's tremendously important. It's been my pleasure to be a part of these events today. Great being here and being a part of this organization. We all need to get out there and do whatever it takes in this community to make a difference. And we really appreciate all of you being with us today. Have a great afternoon. Thanks again for supporting Habitat for Humanity.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for reading. Thank you, Dave.